My neighbor's boyfriend made her 7-year-old son sleep in their 38-degree garage for 3 nights because he believed modern kids were too soft, until I found out the boy had been sneaking into the house at 3 a.m. to sleep in the bathtub and setting his watch to wake up before Marcus got up at 5:30 because the porcelain tub was warmer than the concrete floor where he had to sleep between the lawnmower and recycling bins. My neighbor Jessica knocked on my door at 6 a.m. in tears because her boyfriend Marcus had just forced their 7-year-old son Dylan to sleep in the garage for the 3rd night that week. The temperature had dropped to 38 degrees overnight. Marcus believed modern parenting had created a generation of weaklings who couldn't handle real life. His own father had been a drill sergeant who ran their household like a boot camp, and Marcus was convinced this approach had made him the successful contractor he was today. When Dylan started 2nd grade last fall, he was an energetic kid who loved building elaborate Lego cities and making up adventure stories with his action figures. Everything changed when Marcus moved in 6 months ago and decided Dylan needed to be toughened up. It began with small things that seemed almost reasonable at first. Dylan had to make his bed with military precision every morning, corners tucked exactly right, or he'd have to strip it and start over. No breakfast until the bed passed inspection. Marcus timed how long it took Dylan to get dressed, shower, brush his teeth. Everything had to be completed in specific time windows, or there were consequences. Natural consequences build character, Marcus would say whenever Jessica expressed concern. The real world doesn't give participation trophies or second chances. The garage punishment started when Dylan forgot to put his bicycle away one evening. Marcus declared that if Dylan didn't respect his possessions, he didn't deserve the comfort of sleeping indoors. That first night, Dylan slept on an old camping mat between the lawnmower and recycling bins, using a thin blanket Marcus grudgingly provided after Jessica begged. Dylan's teacher began noticing changes immediately. The boy who used to eagerly share during show and tell now sat silently at his desk. His grades started slipping because he was too exhausted to concentrate. Other parents mentioned Dylan had stopped playing with their kids at recess, instead sitting alone against the building. Marcus saw these changes as progress. He's finally learning that life isn't all fun and games, he announced proudly at dinner, while Dylan pushed food around his plate with dark circles under his eyes. When I was his age, I was already helping my father reshingle the roof. Kids today are babied into helplessness. The garage punishments escalated from forgotten chores to any perceived slight against Marcus's authority. Talking back meant sleeping outside. Taking too long to eat dinner meant sleeping outside. Crying about sleeping outside meant an extra night outside. Jessica tried putting her foot down, but Marcus would accuse her of undermining his authority and creating a mama's boy who'd never survive in the real world. Dylan developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, started wetting the bed, which only gave Marcus more ammunition for his toughening up campaign. The child who once built intricate Lego worlds now flinched whenever anyone raised their voice. He'd stand perfectly still whenever Marcus entered a room, like a small animal hoping a predator wouldn't notice him. The breaking point came when Jessica discovered Dylan had been sneaking into the house at 3 a.m. to sleep in the bathtub, setting his watch to wake him before Marcus got up at 5:30. He'd been doing this for weeks, curled up in the cold porcelain tub because it was warmer than the concrete garage floor. That's when she showed up at my door, desperate for someone to talk sense into Marcus before Child Protective Services got involved. I found Marcus in their kitchen, drinking coffee and reading construction estimates like it was any normal morning. Dylan sat at the table in yesterday's clothes, shivering despite the indoor heating, mechanically eating cereal without making a sound. "Marcus," I said, skipping pleasantries. "Jessica tells me Dylan's been sleeping in the garage as punishment." "Building resilience," Marcus corrected. "My father made me sleep outside plenty of times, made me who I am today." "And who exactly is that? Someone who traumatizes children?" His face darkened. "Trauma is this soft generation's excuse for everything. Dylan needs to learn that actions have consequences. He's 7 years old. His brain is still developing. He's physiologically incapable of the logical reasoning you're demanding. You're not teaching him consequences. You're teaching him that the people who should protect him are actually his biggest threat." "Typical bleeding heart nonsense," Marcus scoffed. "Next, you'll tell me timeouts cause PTSD. I pulled out my phone and showed him articles about child development, attachment theory, and the long-term effects of harsh punishment. Children who experience this kind of treatment don't become stronger. They become anxious, depressed, and struggle with relationships their entire lives. Is that really what you want for Dylan?" Marcus barely glanced at the screen. Internet garbage written by people who've never built anything with their hands. At that moment, Dylan accidentally knocked over his orange juice. The terror that flashed across his face was heartbreaking. He immediately dropped to the floor, frantically trying to clean up the spill with his sleeves while whimpering apologies. "This is what you've created," I said quietly. "A child so terrified of normal childhood accidents that he's using his clothes to clean up juice." Marcus watched his toughened-up son cowering on the floor, and something finally shifted in his expression. Jessica moved toward Dylan, but Marcus's sharp gesture stopped her. The boy remained on the floor, orange juice soaking through his pajama sleeves as he continued his frantic cleaning attempts. I knelt beside Dylan, gently placing my hand on his small shoulder. He flinched violently, then went completely still. His entire body trembled as I helped him to his feet. Jessica finally broke free from Marcus's invisible hold and wrapped her arms around her son, who who buried his face in her shirt. Marcus stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Dylan's whole body tensed at the sound. The contractor crossed his arms, jaw set in that stubborn way I'd seen too many times before. He walked to the window, staring out at the backyard where Dylan's bicycle lay forgotten on the grass again. Jessica guided Dylan to the bathroom to change his wet clothes. I heard her soft murmurs through the door, trying to reassure him that everything was okay. Nothing was okay. We all knew it. Marcus turned from the window, his expression shifting between defiance and something else I couldn't quite read. He picked up his coffee mug, set it down, picked it up again. His hands, usually so steady with power tools, seemed uncertain. The bathroom door opened. Dylan emerged in fresh clothes, holding Jessica's hand so tightly his knuckles were white. They returned to the kitchen, Dylan pressing himself against his mother's side. Marcus watched them, that unreadable expression deepening. I pulled out a chair and sat down, hoping to diffuse the tension. Marcus remained standing, creating an uncomfortable power dynamic. Dylan kept glancing at him, then quickly away, like checking on a storm cloud. Jessica stroked Dylan's hair while he stood frozen beside her. The boy who once chattered non-stop about his Lego creations hadn't spoken a single word since I'd arrived. His silence felt heavy, unnatural for a 7-year-old. Marcus finally sat down across from me. He folded his hands on the table, studying them as if they held answers. The construction estimates lay forgotten, coffee growing cold. Outside, a neighbor's dog barked, the normal sound jarring in our tense bubble. Dylan's stomach growled audibly. He pressed closer to Jessica, as if trying to disappear. Such a basic bodily function had become another source of potential punishment in his mind. My chest tightened, watching this child navigate the minefield of his own home. Marcus noticed too. He pushed the cereal box toward Dylan, a gesture that might have seemed kind if not for the boy's terrified reaction. Dylan looked at his mother for permission before reaching for it with shaking hands. The next few minutes passed in excruciating silence. Dylan ate mechanically, each spoonful careful and quiet. Jessica rubbed his back in small circles. Marcus stared at his son with an expression I was beginning to recognize as dawning comprehension. I thought about all the warning signs Jessica had shared with me over the past months. The increasing isolation, Dylan's teachers' concerns, the neighborhood parents who'd noticed changes. Everyone except Marcus had seen what was happening. Marcus's phone buzzed with a work call. He glanced at it but didn't answer, seemingly unable to shift into his usual business mode. The Marcus who confidently managed construction crews looked lost in his own kitchen, watching his son eat cereal like it was a dangerous activity. Dylan finished eating and carefully carried his bowl to the sink. He rinsed it thoroughly, dried it, and placed it in exactly the right spot in the dishwasher. Every movement was precise, practiced, designed to avoid any possible criticism. Jessica's eyes filled with fresh tears watching her son's robotic movements. She told me how different he used to be, how he'd leave dishes everywhere, forget to brush his teeth, normal kid stuff that now seemed like treasured memories. Marcus stood up again, pacing to the back door. He tested the handle, checked the lock, meaningless activities to avoid looking at what he'd created. His father's methods had produced a successful contractor, yes, but at what cost? I remembered Marcus mentioning his siblings once, how he was the only one who still spoke to their father. The others had cut contact years ago. Now I understood why. The cycle of harsh parenting had claimed another generation. Dylan returned to Jessica's side, whispering something in her ear. I wonder what Marcus is really seeing when he watches Dylan clean up that spilled juice with his sleeves. The way he just stands there while his son panics on the floor makes me curious about what's actually going through his mind versus what he's showing us. She nodded and took his hand, leading him toward the living room. Marcus watched them go, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. Alone with Marcus, I tried once more. I described the research on childhood development, how young brains need safety to grow properly, how fear-based parenting created anxious adults who struggled with relationships and self-worth. Marcus listened this time, really listened. He sank into a chair, running his hands through his hair. The armor of certainty he'd worn for months was cracking, revealing glimpses of the doubt underneath. From the living room, we heard Dylan's small voice asking Jessica if he'd have to sleep in the garage again tonight. Her reassurance sounded hollow. They both knew she couldn't guarantee anything as long as Marcus maintained his rules. Marcus flinched at his son's question. He looked toward the garage door, perhaps imagining the cold concrete floor where his 7-year-old had spent too many nights, the camping mat, the thin blanket, the lawnmower and recycling bins for company. I pulled up more articles on my phone, this time about breaking generational cycles, about how parents could choose different paths than the ones they'd been shown. Marcus actually took the phone, scrolling through with increasing attention. Jessica returned to the kitchen doorway, Dylan clinging to her leg. She looked between Marcus and me, hope and fear warring on her face. 6 months of watching her son disappear into himself had aged her years. Marcus set down my phone and looked at his family, really looked at them. Dylan immediately dropped his gaze to the floor, shoulders hunching in anticipation of criticism. That automatic fear response seemed to hit Marcus like a physical blow. The contractor who prided himself on building solid foundations had to face what he'd built in his own home. Not resilience or character, but a fortress of fear, where his son existed in constant vigilance, where love felt conditional on perfect behavior. Marcus opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. Words seemed to fail him. The man who always had strong opinions about weakness and strength looked genuinely lost. His worldview was colliding with the reality of his terrified child. Dylan whispered something else to Jessica. She bent down to hear him better, then straightened with fresh pain in her eyes. He needed to use the bathroom but was afraid to go alone, afraid of doing something wrong, afraid of existing in his own home. Jessica led Dylan away again, leaving Marcus and me in heavy silence. The morning sun streamed through the kitchen window, highlighting the ordinary domestic scene that had become a battlefield for one small boy's sense of safety. Marcus finally spoke, his voice rough. He talked about his own childhood, the nights spent outside, the constant criticism, the impossibly high standards, how he'd sworn he'd never be weak, like he'd been as a crying child in the cold. But Dylan wasn't weak, I pointed out. He was surviving the only way a 7-year-old could, by becoming invisible, by shrinking himself to avoid danger. That took its own terrible strength, the kind that no child should need to develop. Marcus's phone rang again. Another work call he didn't take. His crews were waiting, projects needed attention, but he seemed frozen in this moment of recognition. The successful contractor faced the ruins of his parenting philosophy. Jessica and Dylan returned once more. Dylan had changed clothes again, apparently having had an accident. The bedwetting Marcus scorned as weakness was actually his small body's response to constant stress, another fact I gently shared. Marcus watched his son's careful movements, the way Dylan monitored every adult expression for signs of danger. The garage punishment had done exactly what Marcus intended, teaching consequences, just not the ones he'd expected. The moment stretched between us, Marcus's eyes fixed on Dylan's trembling form. I watched the contractor's jaw work silently, processing what he was seeing. Jessica held Dylan closer, her protective instincts finally overriding her fear of Marcus's reaction. Marcus pushed back from the table and walked to the garage door. He opened it, staring into the space where he'd banished his son night after night. The camping mat still lay on the concrete floor, the thin blanket folded neatly beside it. Tools hung on the walls, organized with military precision. The recycling bins stood in perfect rows. He closed the door slowly and turned back to us. Dylan immediately stiffened, preparing for whatever punishment might come from Marcus examining his punishment space. The boy's reaction made Marcus pause mid-step. I stood up, positioning myself slightly between them, not threatening, just present. Marcus noticed the protective gesture, and his shoulders sagged slightly. He walked past us to the living room window, watching the neighborhood wake up. Jessica guided Dylan to the couch, settling him beside her. She pulled a throw blanket over his legs, the kind of simple comfort that had become forbidden under Marcus's rules. Dylan accepted it hesitantly, glancing toward Marcus's back. The contractor's phone buzzed again. This time he answered, his voice flat as he postponed the morning's meetings. His crew would have to manage without him. The man who never missed work was choosing to stay home. After hanging up, Marcus remained at the window. I joined him, standing quietly as we watched a neighbor walk their dog. Normal life continuing outside while inside, a family teetered on the edge of collapse. Marcus's hands gripped the windowsill. He started talking about his father again, but differently this time. Not with pride, but with something raw. He described nights spent shivering in a shed, the hunger when meals were withheld as punishment, the constant fear of not measuring up. He talked about his siblings who'd left as soon as they could, his sister who hadn't spoken to their father in 15 years, his brother who changed his last name. Marcus had been the only one who stayed, who tried to earn the old man's approval right up until the funeral. I listened without interrupting. Behind us, Jessica held Dylan, both of them silent witnesses to Marcus's unraveling. The morning light shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Marcus turned from the window and really looked at Dylan, not with the measuring gaze that searched for flaws, but something softer. He took a step toward the couch, then stopped when Dylan pressed deeper into Jessica's side. The contractor who could read blueprints and calculate load-bearing weights couldn't figure out how to approach his own son. He stood there, lost in his own living room, finally seeing the distance he'd created. Jessica shifted on the couch, creating space beside them. An invitation, tentative but real. Marcus stared at the empty spot like it was a foreign concept. When had he last sat with his family without it being a lesson or lecture? He moved toward them slowly, telegraphing every movement. Dylan tracked him with wide eyes, ready to bolt. Marcus sat on the far end of the couch, leaving space between them, not reaching out, just existing in the same space. The silence felt different now, less threatening, more uncertain, like everyone was learning a new language and didn't know the words yet. Dylan's breathing gradually slowed, though he remained pressed against Jessica. I excused myself to make coffee, giving them privacy while staying close enough to intervene. From the kitchen, I heard Marcus clear his throat several times, starting and stopping attempts at speech. The man who barked orders at construction sites couldn't find words for his son. When I returned with 3 mugs, Marcus was showing Dylan something on his phone. Not articles about toughness or discipline, but photos. His construction projects, but more importantly, the Lego sets he'd built as a child. The ones his father had thrown away when he turned 8, declaring them toys for babies. Dylan leaned forward slightly, interest overcoming fear for a moment. He pointed at something on the screen, and Marcus zoomed in. A complicated castle set, the kind Dylan would have loved before fear replaced joy in his life. Jessica sipped her coffee, watching them with cautious hope. She caught my eye and nodded toward the door. Time for me to go, to let them navigate this without an audience. I understood but hesitated, worried about leaving Dylan vulnerable. Marcus noticed my reluctance. He set down his phone and addressed me directly, acknowledging that I'd been right about the damage he was causing. pausing. The admission came hard, each word seemingly pulled from some deep place he'd kept locked. But admissions weren't enough. I made that clear before leaving. Dylan needed to feel safe in his own home. No more garage nights, no more military inspections, no more punishment for being a child. Marcus nodded, but I'd seen him nod before when Jessica raised concerns. I left them there, Marcus still on his side of the couch, Dylan still pressed against Jessica, the space between them filled with years of fear that wouldn't disappear with one conversation. Back in my own house, I watched their windows, ready to return if needed. An hour passed. Through the window, I saw them still on the couch. Marcus had moved closer, showing Dylan more pictures. Jessica had relaxed slightly, though her arm remained protective around her son. Progress maybe, or just the calm before Marcus reverted to old patterns. My phone buzzed, Jessica, texting that Marcus wanted to take Dylan to buy a new Lego set. She was unsure, seeking my opinion. I advised caution, but didn't discourage it. Marcus needed to rebuild their relationship through actions, not words. They left together, all three of them. Dylan walked between his parents, not holding hands, but not shrinking away either. I watched until their car disappeared, then tried to focus on my own day while staying alert for their return. Marcus facing that empty garage mat tells us everything about this turning point. His son associates that cold concrete floor with rejection, while Marcus finally sees it represents his own childhood trauma being passed down like some terrible inheritance. They came back 2 hours later with multiple shopping bags. Through the window, I glimpsed Dylan carrying a large Lego box, the first genuine excitement I'd seen from him in months. Marcus carried more bags, looking uncertain, but trying. The rest of the day passed quietly. No sounds of conflict from their house. That evening, I saw them through the kitchen window, all three at the table. Dylan was building his new set, while Marcus watched, not directing or criticizing, just watching his son create. But trauma doesn't heal in a day. That night, I heard their back door open. From my bedroom window, I saw Dylan standing in the backyard, fully dressed, a blanket in his arms. Marcus found him there, heading for the garage out of habit or fear. Marcus knelt beside his son in the grass. I couldn't hear the words, but I saw him guide Dylan back inside. Saw him carry the boy when Dylan's legs gave out from exhaustion and stress. Saw Jessica meet them at the door, taking Dylan while Marcus stood outside for a long moment. The next morning, Jessica knocked on my door again, not in tears this time, but still worried. Dylan had wet the bed again, and Marcus's initial reaction had been anger before he caught himself. Old patterns died hard, especially when stressed and tired. She asked if I'd talk to Marcus about therapy, for all of them, but especially for him. He'd never agree if she suggested it, viewing therapy as weakness, but maybe from me, framed differently, he might listen. I found Marcus in his garage workshop, organizing tools that were already organized. Displacement activity, avoiding the chaos inside by creating order outside. He didn't look up when I entered, but his shoulders tensed. I started with construction metaphors, foundations that needed repair before building higher, structural damage that required professional assessment. Marcus's hands stilled on his tools as I talked about generational blueprints and the courage required to draft new plans. He resisted at first, falling back on familiar defenses about self-reliance and strength. But when I mentioned Dylan standing in the backyard with his blanket, headed for the garage from pure conditioning, Marcus's facade cracked again. The contractor who fixed other people's homes couldn't fix his own without help. That admission came harder than anything else, but he agreed to consider it, to research therapists who specialized in family trauma, a small victory, but significant. Over the following days, I watched their family navigate this fragile new dynamic. Marcus trying too hard sometimes, overcompensating with gifts and permissions that confused Dylan. Jessica mediating between them, exhausted from hypervigilance but afraid to fully relax. Dylan started testing boundaries, small acts of defiance to see if the rules had really changed, leaving a toy out, taking extra time in the bathroom. Each test met with Marcus visibly struggling not to react with punishment, Jessica intervening when he faltered. The therapy search proved difficult. Marcus rejected several therapists for various reasons, finding fault with their approaches or credentials. I recognized the stalling tactic but kept pushing, providing new options each time he dismissed the previous ones. A week into this new dynamic, everything nearly collapsed. Dylan had a meltdown over homework, the accumulated stress erupting in screaming and thrown pencils. Marcus's patience snapped. He grabbed Dylan's arm, started marching him toward the garage before catching himself. The damage was done. Dylan went limp, all fight leaving him as he prepared for punishment. Marcus released him immediately, horror on his face, but Dylan had already retreated into that protective shell. Jessica scooped up her son, carrying him to his room while Marcus stood frozen in the hallway. I heard the shouting from my house, Jessica's voice, louder than I'd ever heard it, finally unleashing months of suppressed anger. Marcus's responses, defensive, then quiet, a door slamming, then silence that felt more ominous than the yelling. Jessica appeared at my door with Dylan. Could they stay for a while? Just until things calmed down. I welcomed them in, setting Dylan up with cartoons and snacks, while Jessica collapsed at my kitchen table, shaking with adrenaline and fear. She talked about leaving, taking Dylan to her mother's house 2 states away, starting over where Marcus couldn't find them. The plans spilled out, half-formed but desperate. Dylan needed stability, safety, a chance to heal without constant fear of backsliding. But she also talked about Marcus's efforts, the moments of genuine connection, the therapy appointments he'd finally scheduled, the way he'd started reading parenting books, even if he hid them them when anyone entered the room. Progress measured in millimeters, but still progress. I listened without pushing either direction. This had to be Jessica's choice, based on what she believed best for Dylan. The boy sat in my living room, absorbed in cartoons, but alert to every sound from outside, waiting for Marcus to come demanding their return. Marcus didn't come. Hours passed. Jessica checked her phone repeatedly, finding missed calls but no angry messages. As evening approached, she grew anxious about returning. Dylan had fallen asleep on my couch, exhausted from emotional upheaval. Finally, Marcus texted. Not demands or threats, but an apology. He was going to stay at a motel that night, give them space. The therapy appointment was tomorrow. He'd go alone if needed, but hoped they'd consider family sessions eventually. Jessica stared at the message, torn between hope and self-protection. She'd believed his promises before, but this felt different. The voluntary space, the commitment to therapy, the absence of blame or manipulation in his words. She decided to return home with Dylan. I walked them over, staying until they were settled. The house felt different without Marcus's presence, calmer, but also uncertain, like everyone was holding their breath for what came next. That night passed peacefully. The next morning, Marcus attended his therapy appointment. He came home subdued, processing whatever had been discussed. Dylan watched him warily, but Marcus didn't push for interaction, respecting the distance his son needed. Family therapy began the following week. I drove them to the first appointment, Jessica too nervous to drive. Dylan clung to her in the waiting room while Marcus sat apart, all of them looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. They emerged an hour later, emotionally wrung out, but intact. Dylan held a stuffed animal the therapist had given him. Marcus looked shaken. Jessica seemed cautiously optimistic. Small steps, but in the right direction. The sessions continued weekly. Some days I'd see them return looking hopeful. Others, Jessica would be in tears, and Marcus would disappear into his workshop for hours. Dylan started having individual sessions too, learning to process his trauma with professional help. Gradually, changes became visible. Dylan began playing outside again, though always where Jessica could see him. He started inviting a friend over, tentatively rebuilding social connections. The persistent cough finally faded as his stress levels decreased. Marcus struggled more visibly. The therapy forced him to confront not just his actions, but their roots. He'd call in sick to work after particularly difficult sessions, spending days barely functional as he processed decades of buried trauma. But he kept going, kept attending, kept trying. When Dylan flinched at his movements, Marcus would freeze, acknowledge it, and give his son space. When old patterns surfaced, he'd remove himself rather than risk harm. Imperfect progress, but progress nonetheless. The garage transformed first. Marcus and Dylan worked together to convert it from a place of punishment to a workshop. They built shelves for Lego creations, installed better lighting, made it a space for creation rather than isolation. Dylan's bedwetting decreased gradually. The first dry night was celebrated quietly, without the shame that would have accompanied it before. Marcus bit back old responses, offering encouragement instead of criticism when accidents still happened. Jessica found her voice more each day, no longer mediating or managing Marcus's moods. She focused on her own healing and Dylan's needs. She started individual therapy too, processing her role in enabling the situation through fear and learned helplessness. 3 months after that first morning she'd knocked on my door, they invited me for dinner. Dylan had built an elaborate Lego city on the dining table, explaining each building with growing confidence. Marcus listened attentively, asking questions that showed genuine interest. The military precision remained in some ways. Dishes were still done immediately after dinner. Bedtime routines stayed consistent, but now these felt like structure rather than control, boundaries rather than prison walls. Dylan still struggled. Loud noises made him jump. Unexpected changes in routine caused anxiety. He'd sometimes stand frozen when asked to make simple choices, paralyzed by fear of choosing wrong. The therapist assured them this was normal, that healing took time. Marcus attended parenting classes alongside therapy. He'd return home with handouts and worksheets, practicing active listening and emotional validation. Sometimes Jessica would find him reading them late at night, highlighting passages and taking notes. The transformation wasn't smooth or linear. Bad days still happened. Marcus would slip into harsh tones when stressed. Dylan would regress to fearful compliance. Jessica would panic at signs of backsliding, but they had tools now, strategies for managing these moments. I remained involved, but at a respectful distance. Jessica would update me on their progress. Sometimes she'd need to vent about setbacks. Dylan would show me his latest Lego creations. Marcus would nod acknowledgement when we passed, still uncomfortable with the vulnerability I'd witnessed. One evening, I saw them in the backyard. Dylan was teaching Marcus to play some complicated game involving action figures. Marcus looked confused but engaged, following his son's elaborate rules without trying to simplify or control them. Jessica sat nearby, reading a book but watching them. The hypervigilance had faded to normal parental awareness. She could relax now, trusting that Marcus wouldn't suddenly revert to punishment over perceived infractions. The garage door stayed open most days now. Dylan would work on projects there, Marcus nearby but not hovering. They'd built a comfortable reading nook in one corner, complete with soft cushions and warm blankets, a far cry from the cold concrete and thin camping mat. Dylan's teacher reported improvements. He was participating in class again, playing with friends at recess, turning in homework without the previous perfectionist anxiety. Still quieter than before, still cautious, but returning to himself gradually. Marcus's construction business suffered during this period. He'd cut back hours for therapy and family time. Some clients grew frustrated with delays, but he held firm to the new priorities, recognizing that success meant nothing if his son feared him. The extended family presented challenges. Marcus's mother visited, full of criticism about soft parenting and coddling. Marcus asked her to leave when she berated Dylan for crying over a scraped knee, a significant moment, choosing his son's emotional safety over his mother's approval. Jessica's family remained skeptical but supportive. Her mother had never liked Marcus, and these events confirmed her worst fears, but she respected Jessica's decision to try rebuilding rather than leaving, offering support without judgment. Dylan started sleeping through the night consistently. No more 3 a.m. trips to the bathtub. No more standing in the backyard with his blanket. His room became a true sanctuary, filled with toys and books and all the comfort items Marcus had previously banned as babyish. The house felt different now. Laughter returned gradually. Dylan would joke with Jessica, even occasionally with Marcus. Family movie nights became regular events, with Dylan choosing films without fear of picking wrong. Small normalcies that felt monumental. Marcus continued therapy even as the crisis passed. He was processing deeper issues now, the childhood that had shaped his harmful beliefs. Some sessions left him withdrawn and quiet. Others seemed to lift invisible weights from his shoulders. They'd found a rhythm that worked, not perfect, but functional. Marcus could recognize his triggers now, step away when old patterns threatened to surface. Dylan could express needs and wants without fear of punishment. Jessica could maintain boundaries without apology. 6 months after that terrible morning, Dylan had a friend sleep over. The boys stayed up late building Legos and telling stories, normal 7-year-old behavior that would have been forbidden before. Marcus checked on them once, smiled at their elaborate constructions, and left them to play. Progress was measured in these moments. Dylan asking Marcus for help with homework without fear. Marcus sitting through Dylan's rambling stories without impatience. Jessica relaxing enough to leave them alone together without anxiety. The garage had become Dylan's favorite space. He decorated it with his creations, drawings, and treasures. Sometimes I'd see him working there with the door open, Marcus at his workbench nearby. Parallel play, the therapist called it. Connection without pressure. Bad days still came. Dylan would have nightmares about cold concrete floors. Marcus would struggle with patience during stressful work periods. Jessica would panic at any sign of regression. But they had support now, strategies for weathering these storms. Marcus had started volunteering with a local youth organization, teaching basic construction skills. Working with other children helped him practice patience and appropriate expectations. Seeing how easily kids responded to encouragement rather than criticism reinforced his therapy lessons. Dylan's confidence grew slowly but steadily. He joined a Lego robotics club at school, made friends with shared interests, started asserting preferences about food, clothes, activities. Each choice made without fear was a small victory. The family attended support groups for trauma recovery. Hearing other stories helped normalize their struggles. Marcus connected with other fathers working to break generational cycles. Jessica found strength in mothers who'd faced similar situations. Their therapist introduced gradual challenges. Marcus supervising bedtime routines without Jessica present. Dylan expressing anger safely when frustrated. Jessica trusting Marcus's judgment on discipline decisions. Each step carefully monitored and adjusted as needed. The house rules evolved into family agreements. Everyone contributed ideas during weekly meetings. Dylan's suggestions were heard and incorporated. Marcus learned to negotiate rather than dictate. Jessica facilitated without managing everyone's emotions. I watched this transformation with relief and admiration. The family who'd been broken by rigid control was healing through flexibility and communication. Not every story like theirs ended this way. Many dissolved in divorce courts and custody battles. But Marcus's willingness to change, Jessica's courage to demand it, and Dylan's resilience despite everything had created possibility from crisis. The work was far from over. Years of therapy lay ahead, but the foundation was rebuilding, stronger for having been properly examined. Dylan still flinched sometimes at unexpected movements, still sought reassurance for normal childhood mistakes, still struggled with the hypervigilance trauma had instilled, but he laughed more, played more, trusted more. Childhood was returning in small doses. Marcus still battled his father's voice in his head, still felt urges to control and punish that he had to consciously resist, still mourned the relationship he'd nearly destroyed while working to build a new one, but he showed up. Every day he chose differently than his father had. Jessica still worried, still monitored interactions with practiced awareness, still planned exit strategies she hoped never to use, but she also rested, trusted, began believing in the possibility of a healthy family dynamic. The morning Jessica had knocked on my door felt like a lifetime ago. The terrified woman and traumatized child had been replaced by a family actively choosing healing. The road ahead remained long and uncertain, but they were walking it together. As I write this, I can hear Dylan playing in their backyard. His laughter carries across the fence, free and unguarded. Marcus is teaching him to use child-safe tools, building something together. Jessica tends her garden nearby, glancing up occasionally with a smile instead of fear. They weren't perfect. Perfection had nearly destroyed them. Instead, they were human, flawed, trying, making mistakes and apologies, learning and growing, building something stronger than military corners and rigid rules could ever create. The garage door stays open now, welcoming rather than punishing. Dylan's Lego cities spread across workbenches and shelves. Sometimes I see the three of them there together, together, creating and connecting in the space that once symbolized isolation. The following week brought an unexpected test. Marcus's mother arrived unannounced, carrying a suitcase and the same rigid expectations that had shaped her son. I watched from my window as she marched up their driveway, her posture military straight despite her age. Jessica met her at the door, Dylan hiding behind his mother's legs. The older woman's disapproval radiated as she surveyed the toys scattered across the living room floor. Marcus emerged from his workshop, his face going pale at the sight of his mother. Within minutes, the tension became palpable. Marcus's mother began reorganizing Dylan's toys into precise rows, lecturing about discipline and order. Dylan retreated to his room while Jessica stood frozen, caught between defending her son and avoiding conflict with her potential mother-in-law. Marcus initially fell into old patterns, straightening cushions and clearing surfaces his mother deemed messy. But when she demanded Dylan come downstairs to properly greet her, something shifted. Marcus intercepted her march toward the stairs, placing himself between his mother and his son's sanctuary. The argument that followed shook the house. Marcus's mother invoked his father's memory, accused him of raising a weak child, threatened to stay until proper discipline was restored. Marcus's voice grew steadier with each accusation, drawing boundaries he'd never dared establish before. I heard the front door slam from my kitchen. Through the window, I saw Marcus's mother dragging her suitcase back to her rental car, her face twisted with indignation. Marcus stood on the porch, hands shaking but posture firm. He'd chosen his son over his mother's approval. Jessica appeared beside him, Dylan peeking out from behind her. They watched the car disappear, then Marcus knelt before his son. No words were needed. Dylan stepped forward and wrapped his small arms around his father's neck. Marcus held him carefully, as if handling something precious and breakable. The next therapy session proved particularly intense. Marcus returned home drained, spending hours in the garage workshop not to avoid his family, but to process what he'd discussed. Dylan brought him a sandwich around dinner time, setting it quietly on the workbench before retreating. Marcus ate it slowly, acknowledging the gesture with a grateful nod. School conferences arrived, bringing new challenges. Dylan's teacher reported significant improvement, but noted lingering anxiety during group activities. Dylan teaching Marcus that complicated game really makes me wonder what's going through Marcus's head as he follows all those wild rules without trying to take over. The way Jessica watches them from behind her book shows she's still checking everything, even while trying to look relaxed about their new normal. Marcus attended for the first time, sitting beside Jessica instead of dominating the conversation. He asked thoughtful questions about supporting Dylan's progress rather than demanding higher performance. Halloween approached, and Dylan tentatively asked about trick-or-treating. Previous years under Marcus's rules had meant limited candy and early bedtimes. This year, Marcus helped Dylan design an elaborate robot costume using cardboard and aluminum foil. They worked together in the garage, Marcus teaching basic construction skills with infinite patience. The night itself tested everyone's progress. Dylan initially refused to approach houses with loud decorations or sudden noises. Marcus started to show frustration, then caught himself. He suggested they skip the scary houses, focusing on Dylan's comfort over candy quantity. Jessica watched this interaction with visible relief. November brought Marcus's work busy season. Construction projects piled up, deadlines loomed, and stress levels rose. One evening, Dylan spilled paint on Marcus's project blueprints. The old Marcus would have exploded. Instead, he closed his eyes, took several deep breaths, and helped Dylan clean up the mess. But the stress showed in other ways. Marcus grew short-tempered with Jessica, snapped at minor inconveniences, retreated into himself. The family therapist introduced coping strategies, ways to recognize and manage triggers before they escalated. Marcus practiced these religiously, though not always successfully. Dylan's birthday approached in early December. Previous birthdays had been rigid affairs with educational gifts and structured activities. This year, Dylan requested a sleepover with 3 friends. Marcus initially balked at the chaos of multiple 7-year-olds, then agreed to try. The party planning revealed how far they'd come. Dylan chose the menu without seeking approval for each item. Jessica decorated without worrying about Marcus's reaction to the mess. Marcus himself suggested they convert the garage into a gaming space for the boys, complete with blanket forts. The night of the party tested everyone. 4 boys creating magnificent chaos, staying up past bedtime, making noise that would have previously earned punishment. Marcus retreated to his bedroom several times, overwhelmed by the disorder, but he always returned, even joining their Lego building competition at one point. One boy's parents arrived early, concerned about leaving their son overnight. They'd heard rumors about Marcus's strict parenting. Jessica handled the conversation gracefully while Marcus hung back, understanding their caution. Trust in the community would take time to rebuild. The sleepover succeeded despite minor hiccups. Dylan glowed with happiness, finally able to be a normal kid with friends. Marcus survived the chaos, even managing to laugh when he found the boys had built a Lego fortress around his coffee maker. Small victories, hard won, but precious. Winter arrived with new challenges. Dylan caught the flu, reverting to anxious behaviors when fever made him vulnerable. He begged not to be sent to the garage despite burning up under multiple blankets. Marcus sat by his bed for hours, placing cool washcloths on his forehead, reassuring him he was safe. Jessica got sick next, leaving Marcus as primary caregiver. Old fears surfaced as Dylan watched his father take charge, but Marcus managed medications gently, efficiently, made soup without demanding it be eaten immediately, even read stories in fumbling attempts at different voices. Not perfect, but trying. The garage workshop became their shared sanctuary. Marcus taught Dylan basic woodworking with child-safe tools. They built a birdhouse together, Marcus guiding but not controlling. When Dylan accidentally split the wood, Marcus showed him how to repair it rather than starting over. Mistakes became learning opportunities, not failures. Christmas discussions revealed lingering tensions. Marcus's family expected them to travel for the holidays, maintaining traditions he'd grown up with. Jessica's family wanted them to visit too, though they remained wary of Marcus. Dylan grew anxious at the thought of leaving his safe spaces. They decided to stay home, creating new traditions. Marcus struggled with this break from family expectations, but prioritized Dylan's needs. They decorated the tree together, Dylan placing ornaments wherever he wanted. Marcus bit his tongue when the distribution looked uneven, learning to value joy over perfection. Gift shopping showed Marcus's growth. Instead of educational toys designed to build specific skills, he paid attention to Dylan's actual interests. He spent hours researching the perfect Lego sets, even visiting online forums to understand what 7-year-olds actually wanted versus what adults thought they should want. Christmas morning arrived peacefully. Dylan woke early but waited until his parents stirred, no longer afraid of breaking rules by being excited. He opened presents with genuine enthusiasm, not the performed gratitude Marcus had previously demanded. Marcus watched his son's joy with an expression of wonder. The new year brought reflection. Marcus initiated a family meeting to discuss goals and concerns, not dictating resolutions, but asking for input. Dylan contributed ideas with growing confidence. Jessica spoke freely about her needs. Marcus listened more than he talked, taking notes on how to support his family. School resumed with Dylan showing continued progress. He joined an after-school art club, something Marcus would have previously deemed frivolous. Marcus adjusted his work schedule to pick Dylan up, using the drive home to hear about Dylan's day without interrogating or correcting. A crisis came when Dylan got in trouble at school for pushing another child. The old Marcus would have implemented severe punishment. Instead, he sat with Dylan to understand what happened. Dylan explained the other boy had been bullying a smaller kid. Marcus navigated teaching appropriate responses while validating Dylan's protective instincts. Valentine's Day brought unexpected sweetness. Dylan made cards for both parents in art class. Marcus's card read, "I love you, Daddy," with crooked letters and abundant glitter. Marcus displayed it prominently in his workshop, not caring that glitter now contaminated his organized space. Spring arrived with baseball season. Dylan wanted to try but feared disappointing Marcus if he wasn't good. Marcus signed him up, promising to support him regardless of performance. He attended practices, cheering for effort rather than results. When Dylan struck out repeatedly, Marcus focused on the courage it took to keep trying. The garage transformation continued. They installed better heating, added comfortable seating, created zones for different activities. It became the neighborhood hangout spot, kids knowing they were welcome. Marcus learned to tolerate noise and mess, finding joy in Dylan's growing social confidence. Marcus's business evolved too. He started scheduling more flexibly, turning down projects that would require excessive time away. Some clients left for more available contractors. Marcus accepted this consequence, recognizing what he'd almost lost by prioritizing work over family. Mother's Day highlighted Jessica's journey. Dylan made breakfast with Marcus's help, both focused on showing appreciation for her strength. Jessica cried at their efforts, not from sadness, but from relief at how far they'd come. The woman who'd knocked on my door in desperation now stood confident in her own home. Summer plans required negotiation. Marcus suggested camping to teach outdoor skills. Jessica worried about regression to harsh lessons. They compromised on cabin camping with modern amenities, focusing on fun rather than survival skills. Dylan participated in planning, his preferences considered equally. The camping trip revealed remaining challenges. Marcus struggled with Dylan's fear of the dark, initially dismissive before catching himself. He stayed up with Dylan, pointing out constellations and making up stories about them. Not the harsh lessons his father would have imposed, but gentle guidance through fear. Back home, they maintained summer routines that balanced structure with flexibility. Dylan attended day camps chosen for fun rather than achievement. Marcus picked him up daily, learning to ask, "Did you have fun?" instead of, "What did you learn?" Small language changes reflecting deeper shifts. As autumn approached, they faced the anniversary of when everything changed. Dylan had nightmares leading up to it, occasionally still heading for the garage in his sleep. Marcus would gently redirect him, sometimes sitting in Dylan's room until he settled. No impatience, just quiet presence. The therapy sessions had spaced out to bi-weekly, then monthly, not because they were fixed, but because they'd developed tools to manage independently. The therapist remained available for crisis sessions, which became increasingly rare. Progress measured in longer stretches between setbacks. Dylan started second grade with a different teacher, requiring adjustment. Marcus attended orientation, introducing himself without mentioning past issues. He volunteered for field trips, learning to manage groups of children without military precision. Other parents began trusting him, seeing his genuine efforts. The garage had become Dylan's pride. He gave tours to new friends, showing off their collaborative projects. Marcus added Dylan's name to the workshop sign, making him official co-owner. They worked side by side on weekends, Marcus following Dylan's creative lead more often than directing. Halloween came again, marking a full year of change. Dylan chose his costume independently, Fortunately, Marcus helped construct it without taking over. Jessica documented everything with photos. They trick-or-treated until Dylan was ready to stop, not according to predetermined schedules. Natural consequences, not forced ones. November brought Marcus's mother back for Thanksgiving. She arrived with the same suitcase but different energy. The previous confrontation had shifted something. She watched Marcus interact with Dylan, saw the genuine connection, the easy affection. Progress was undeniable, even to her rigid worldview. The holiday meal itself showed transformation. Dylan helped cook, making mistakes that became part of the story, rather than sources of shame. Marcus's mother started to criticize the messy kitchen, then stopped herself. She even asked Dylan about his Lego creations, listening to his enthusiastic explanations. As December arrived, I reflected on the journey I'd witnessed. The family that had been broken by generational trauma was healing through daily choices. Not perfectly, not without setbacks, but steadily. Dylan's laughter came easier. Marcus's control loosened further. Jessica's confidence grew stronger. The garage stood open despite winter cold, heated and welcoming. Dylan worked on a complex Lego city, incorporating ideas from architecture books Marcus had bought him, not because he had to learn, but because he wanted to. Marcus built alongside him, following Dylan's urban planning vision. Their story wasn't ending. Healing from trauma takes years, sometimes lifetimes, but they'd changed the trajectory. Dylan would grow up knowing love could exist without conditions, that mistakes were learning opportunities, that his voice mattered. Marcus would continue wrestling his demons, but no longer passing them on. Jessica had found her strength, no longer the terrified woman at my door, but an advocate for her family's health. She set boundaries with grace, supported both Dylan and Marcus in their growth, and had begun healing her own wounds from enabling harmful patterns. I still watched their windows sometimes, but now I saw normal family life. Messy, imperfect, occasionally difficult, but no longer dangerous. The garage that had been a place of punishment had become a symbol of transformation. Dylan's artwork covered the walls where tools once hung in military precision. As winter deepened, they strung lights in the garage workshop, creating a warm glow visible from the street. Neighbors would stop by to see Dylan's latest creations. Marcus would offer coffee and conversation, the rigid contractor replaced by a father still learning but committed to growth. The morning Jessica knocked on my door felt like a lifetime ago, because it was. They'd lived multiple lifetimes in these months, shedding old skins and growing new ones. The work continued daily, choosing patience over control, love over fear, flexibility over rigidity. Dylan still had anxious days. Marcus still fought old instincts. Jessica still worried about regression, but they had tools now, support systems, and most importantly, commitment to doing better. The cycle of generational trauma had been interrupted, if not entirely broken. Their house had become a home. The garage had become a haven. The family that almost shattered had reformed stronger, held together not by rigid rules, but by choice, effort, and the radical act of changing patterns that had seemed carved in stone. I personally enjoyed telling this story. If you enjoyed it as well, subscribe for more.